And with that, just to get some awareness of the event, feel free to utilize your favorite social network and post information about it. Before we get started here, just want to do a quick shout out to all of the sponsors of these great events. Obviously with them moving to a virtual environment, giving away gift cards and prizes does take an army. So if you have a chance to visit their websites or reach out to them, certainly do that. There's really good organizations on this list, and they continue to sponsor all the different user groups and other community events here in the Minnesota market. All right, so today what we're going to talk about here is Microsoft Teams adoption. And so when we take a look at that side of it, that's a really tricky thing to unpack here in 75 minutes. That's roughly how long we're going to go here this morning. When you take a look at unpacking Microsoft Teams adoption, there's a lot of information there. And what works for some organizations may not work for others. And what works for you may not work for even some of your peers inside of your organization. So we'll unpack a lot of different elements on a lot of different items. This is going to be fast paced. We're not going to dive deep into one specific topic for us. We'll just touch on it and continue to move on. If you have some specific guidance or items that have worked when I introduce them, feel free to put them in the chat so everyone else that's attending can also learn and go through that. I do work for an organization called RSM. RSM is a tax audit consulting organization. I head up our Microsoft Teams adoption and enablement practice across the nation for that. All right, so when we take a look at it, some of the elements, I think that first bullet point that's on here is really the key piece. Users come kicking and screaming. Some users are coming along with it without any resistance whatsoever. But you do know that if you have that one user that is kicking and screaming and is vocal enough, then oftentimes you're doomed. And so let's explore some of those different items here. So what we're going to touch on here, first of all, is some of the trends that we're seeing today across technology, as well as working with multiple generations. I think that that's an important element here to take a look at. And then the other piece, we certainly could dive deeper into is that whole hybrid experience. What are those office spaces going to look like in the future when you start to have in-person as well as online or video virtual participation? We'll take a look at deploying Microsoft Teams, some of the integration with other technologies, whether it's like learning pathways. I know that there's a dedicated session to learning pathways, so I'm just going to introduce it. We won't dive deep into that here, but also taking a look at some of the other integrations here, whether it's with Viva Connections, Viva Insights, or just the Insights capability of it. Sometimes it takes that single application or that single benefit to drive people to a specific tool. And if we step out real quick and we don't relate it to Microsoft Teams, one of the pieces that I hear oftentimes is using OneDrive or using SharePoint and the ability to access your content from any device anywhere in the world is sometimes that one little feature that organizations, forget about. And if they highlight it, sometimes that adoption comes a lot easier and a lot quicker for it. So there's my contact information. If you do have any, specific questions or feedback or comments, you can get a hold of me on Twitter, find me on LinkedIn, or shoot me an email message as well. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk through some of the trends that we're seeing. So the modern worker, when we take a look at what the modern worker means, and I think that modern worker component of it changes a little bit here as we look at, what we're working on today and where we've been in the last year. But I think the key thing is always mobile, right? Even lately, in the last year, you may have been at home the entire time and you're working from your home office, guest bedroom, wherever the case may be. But at the same time, that mobile experience is important as you're maybe walking to go make yourself another cup of coffee or make yourself lunch or maybe go to your kid's bus stop, for instance. The always moving. It's not travel as much anymore, although that's slowly coming back. you're still mobile. The desire for collaboration and teamwork, this is a component that is not slowing down. And so this is where Microsoft Teams can really help quite a bit in terms of identifying where that collaboration and teamwork item is. The one thing that drives me absolutely crazy is when people compare other tools to Microsoft Teams. And the reason why I think it drives me crazy here specifically is just with the component and the concept that Microsoft Teams does more than just one thing. And so that communication, collaboration, teamwork element of it does lend itself heavily to Microsoft Teams. And so that comparison is really a difficult thing to do. Living in social networks, working on multiple devices. I mean, you could join this meeting from your phone or from an iPad and jump back and forth with no major issues there. Data decision making, this is one that Power BI helps out a ton with. And even when you take a look at the Microsoft Teams ecosystem, the ability here to see some of the analytics on calls and quality are certainly there. And then the last piece here is external parties, to work towards it. And this is one that I'll be completely open and honest. I don't think Microsoft Teams does a great job with here yet itself. I think when you take a look at that elements out there, that whole guest account access isn't as clean as I would hope it to be. But understanding that, that is certainly an important component that we need to look at and keep track of here. All right, let's continue on here for us. Some key trends here to take a look at itself. I'll load these all up on the screen just real quickly to take a look at. Within the workplace today, we have a lot of different generations, that are working. And this is a little bit older of a slide because if you come over into the flexible area, you'll see 72% of workers will work remotely by 2020 with that. And I left that in there on purpose because keep that in mind that that was what the plan was before the pandemic. Now with that, I think we need to readjust what that flexibility, certainly means out there. Also with the data rich side of it, finding data is so important today. I know for myself when I'm trying to find something inside my organization, I rely so much on search that if it did not work or I don't do the right search, I get frustrated and I get, it's difficult for me to find it. And so that's where I think that integration with Bing and Microsoft Search is really important, that I can just go out there as long as I'm logged in, perform a search like I would on any of my favorite search engines and be able to filter and find work-related items really quick. The other piece is the vulnerability side of it. And this is one where I think a lot of organizations forget about it. It's a lot easier to protect one account than it is to protect 3 different service accounts, right? Or 3 different accounts across multiple services. So maybe you're an organization that quickly deployed, Zoom, or maybe you're using 8x8 or Ring Central for your phone system. Maybe you're using Slack as well. Maybe somebody has gone ahead and spun up other services that you're not aware of, or maybe you are aware of. The more identities you have to manage, the more difficult it is and the more vulnerable you are to those itself. Let's take a look at how digitally, different generations exist. And so this is a really good diagram that I use on a regular basis to identify not only the different offerings or service lines within inside of Microsoft Teams, but also with the component of what do people want to do? What do people want to, what is that general expectation? And yes, I know that some of you may say, hey, I'm not a millennial. I don't identify as a millennial. Or, heck no, I am not a baby boomer. I work like a millennial, or I work like Generation Z. And of course, there's outliers, right? But I think even if you took away the top portions that's there, you could identify most people in your organization into one of the 4 categories. And so when you're looking at this item here itself, obviously, if we unpack just the meetings aspect of it, the no video or video, the video side of it itself, I think we're all maybe a little burned out from a video component that's there. But at the same time, generally speaking, that is pretty accurate, that as the younger you are, the more comfortable you are with video on itself. Also, when you're taking a look at the no video aspect of it here, that's an important component too, is can you get work done without video, and is it needed or not? And how do you work with that if somebody's not able to turn their camera on? Instant messaging as well as persistent chat down below itself. Obviously, those are a little bit different, although a lot of you might treat those as being the same. Instant messaging, how I would describe it, is just the ability to send a quick ad hoc message to another user, which obviously could be in Teams, whereas persistent messaging itself, or persistent chat, is the ability to jump to any device, have it available to them, send offline, always be almost an email replacement, which is what Teams is. So you may group those or loop those together itself. Enterprise social networking, the third from the bottom there's Yammer for you, right? We saw that peak of Yammer itself, and now it's kind of just staying steady, and there's a use for it, but maybe not in a huge use for it. So anyways, with that, just wanted to share that with you, because I think that that's an important element here, is when you're looking at that adoption, understanding what tools and what features others in the organization would actually go ahead and take a part of and use. All right. Challenges in our legacy workplace. So when we're taking a look at our challenges in our legacy workplace themselves, I think understanding that it can be difficult to work and collaborate with other people. It can be wasting time for others to send you information, or maybe for you to find the information itself. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a lot of information in terms of when do employees move careers or move jobs out there. And obviously some is their choice, some is not their choice. But a lot of people will move organizations when technology isn't up to the speed that they expect it to be. And so I think that that's an important element, and that's where it's nice to move to a SaaS-based model for software, where you're constantly getting those updates, because everything's up to date, everything's fresh. You're not waiting 3 to 5 years to make that happen. So with that being said, just some information here for us. So let's go ahead and let's talk through kind of that modern work journey and framework here for us. This is a roadmap that some of you may have seen before. But when you take a look at where your different elements fit in, and this is where, where we're really going to focus is over here on the right-hand side of the screen, on the front end, or the end user component. But there's a lot that needs to happen before you even get to this point, right? We all know that people can log into Microsoft Teams easier, but how are we managing that access? How do we manage the conditional access? How do we manage what devices users have the ability to go on? Do we manage Intune, from a device management side of it? Do we let users log in from anywhere in the world with multi-factor? So there's a lot of different items that need to be managed in the back end. But when we move to the front end, this is really where we get into that adoption side of the world. Just because a tool's available doesn't mean people are using it. And the best example I have for that is a tool like Insights, or a tool like Microsoft To Do. That is one that, or even Bookings, and that has nothing to do with Teams, other than the aspect of these are all available with most Office 365 plans. And the number of times that I do a presentation, or that I talk to someone and I inform them about Microsoft To Do, or Tasks by Planner and To Do that's integrated with Teams, or the Insights capability, which has been around for a while to protect focus time and schedule your lunch and keep track of who you're working with. And then also Bookings, which also has integration and shifts and other tools that have that integration into Teams. No one knows. And if you don't know, it can be difficult to adopt a technology. For instance, if someone's not going to use chat, if somebody's comfortable using their phone and actually picking up and calling someone, or sending an email, leading with the concept of chat is not going to help you get that user to adopt the technology. The same thing with the file side from a teamwork and collaboration. I have a client that I work with that came from SharePoint 2010. They have a very robust metadata practice in terms of their data and how they architect it in SharePoint. A year ago, they said, we want to roll out Microsoft Teams because our users are asking to be able to collaborate and work with their files at the same time. What really worked for them was the chat side of it with some links to their SharePoint site. The reason for it being is their SharePoint site was so robust and built out and structured in such a manner that people didn't want to abandon that to move into a teamwork or Teams ecosystem or workspace environment. With that being said here, identifying some of those use cases, and we'll talk about a few of those use cases here in a little bit, but understanding how can we use it maybe for project management? How can we use it for file sharing? How can we use it for those different apps and different integration points that are there? When you move over to the far right-hand side of the screen itself, that's where really that innovation side of the security roadmap. That's where you may introduce sensitive information or retention or labeling, data loss prevention, those types of components. All right, let's get into Teams here. So just as I know we all know this, but I like to include this in here. Obviously, if you go and download it, then you have this here. But Microsoft Teams, everything's connected into one location. It's available on any device, so whether you're on a mobile device with the app, which is great, whether you're in the browser experience, which you'll see me in a browser experience today, or obviously on the installed or the local copy here. But there's a lot of Microsoft tools out there, right? So whether it's the Office suite or whether it's using Planner, Power BI, Stream, Forms, I mean, the list can go on in terms of all that integration aspect of it. Across the top, of course, is your main, kind of 3 or 4 workloads that are there. The one that I always like to include in is the meeting side of it. So you have your phone system, your one-to-one calling that's available. You have your chat side of the world. You have your teamwork. And then the other piece that I feel is always missing out of here is the meetings element of it, just like what we're in here today. And obviously, there's been some changes from a meetings piece of it here lately with larger meetings and people being able to do view only, as well as the webinar style and the webinar availability to sign up to really help and focus in on live events. All right. So deployment considerations here. This is a diagram that I really like to help out in terms of helping users identify how things map to SharePoint. And so one of the first things that I think is important is that when you're talking about Teams and when you're talking about the storage of content and the storage of files, if you can get away without using the word SharePoint, I think that's great. However, it's virtually impossible. And the reason why it's virtually impossible is because, of course, SharePoint is used everywhere inside of a team. So when you upload a file to a specific location, you see that. Stepping back here a little bit, the reason why this diagram helps out quite a bit is if you have users that use the OneDrive Sync client and want to bring those files locally outside of Teams and into their Windows Explorer-like environment, of course, you'll want to coach them and tell them, that you'll want to probably sync at the top level, right? You'll want to sync at the top level. Because if you just sync the general channel, then you're missing all of its peers. You're missing the other channels that are associated with it. And so that's really the important component to think about and to remember from that element here is that wherever you click the sync button depends upon what content you have available itself. I would be interested and curious on how many of you lead or tell your users about the OneDrive Sync client, or do you just let users kind of discover it on their own? And I'm talking current, not 3-4 years ago when it worked horribly, but currently, do any of you lead with the concept of the sync client? With that being said here, of course, understanding where OneDrive fits in. I have so many clients I work with that say, we want to roll out Teams, but we don't want to roll out OneDrive. And I'm like, well, if you have users that use Teams, they're probably already using OneDrive. And I was on a conversation or a call yesterday with a client of mine And we're in the process. They moved their email over, Teams has been deployed. Now we're talking about the file migration from their Dropbox environment over. And one of the things that they were shocked with was when they went into their OneDrives, they already saw content there. And they said, how did this content even get there? Well, it goes into the Teams chat files because they've uploaded a file or shared a file that way. So when you're talking about adoption and a training around Microsoft Teams, I think the key takeaway here is you can't just focus in on one technology. You have to focus in on the entire ecosystem and how it all works together. So some of you that have been to my sessions before, you'll recognize this diagram. Those of you that have not been to this session before or to a session of mine before, feel free to take a screenshot of this. If you download the deck, this is a fully editable table that's there. But when you think about it here, the idea is, where does that collaboration come through? And so this is just one of the use cases, right? This is just one of the use cases is file collaboration. And the file collaboration side of it itself, you of course have OneDrive, you have Teams, and you have SharePoint. And for every organization, your definition may be slightly off. However, I want to point you down to the 3 arrows down here at the bottom of the screen. Those 3 arrows down here at the bottom of the screen are important because OneDrive is less formal, right? The user has more control. SharePoint, generally more formal. Yes, I know that some of you may have SharePoint project sites or SharePoint sites that are really informal collaboration experiences. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the core concept of an intranet. And when you look at that aspect of it, of course, that's more formal, that's managed by the organization, larger group involved, more communication focused, less collaboration or team site focused for it. So here, when you're taking a look at this side of it, understanding that when you're referring to collaboration in 365, these are the things that are at users' fingertips. And just because you could have a team of one person doesn't mean that that's the best way to go about it. And so just because you could build a OneDrive and have a spider web of shared files, that doesn't mean that's the best way to do it. But, with that being said, developing that organizational strategy or more or less just documenting what that organizational strategy is an important item that hopefully some of you have already begun with and started down the path of. Let's talk through, the documented document flow. And I know we're not talking about Teams chat in this case. We're not talking about Teams meetings or those other features that are there. We're talking heavily on the documents here, at least first. When you think about this item itself is telling users how they can use the tools or how they can use the technology. And what I want you to do is I want you to step back real quick. And I want you to think about if you had to explain how to use a cell phone to your parents or to an older, to someone in their 70s or 80s. And if you think about what that means for you, it means like, hey, I can use this as an example. My mom's in her 70s and I could say, Mom, text messaging is great. Here's how you use this. When you have a quick question or need to get a hold of me about something, send it to me in text messaging. If you have an urgent item, call me. If you have something that you just want to tell me about, send me an email, right? The same thing comes through with the document flow with inside of 365 is, where do they start? Where does the document end up? Where do I work on the document itself? And so this diagram really helps a lot of people understand that, I may start my document here in OneDrive. I move it into Teams, and that's where I collaborate and work on my document, with other people. Then maybe I move it into SharePoint, or maybe I start in OneDrive and I move that policy that I create in OneDrive directly over into SharePoint itself. And then, of course, there's an archive or delete process that's there. So when you're thinking about that, understanding and communicating what the best practice or how the organization will use those appropriate tools and technologies is important, because users don't know. If they don't know, they don't know. And so that's where it's important for you to communicate that process itself. All right, let's continue on here for ourselves. So the next piece we're going to jump into here is some of the certifications, that are available for you. And these are just items to be aware of, that if you're looking to become more focused in on the adoption side of the world, what types of elements can you do for professional development to professional learning. And with that, one of the items is there is a Microsoft Teams learning path that's available. The link's available there. Otherwise, a quick online search will find it. But with that being said, it's going to give you a good overview of Microsoft Teams. And if you're an organization that subscribes to LinkedIn Learning or Brainstorm's Quick Help or any of the other LMS-like tools out there, of course, there's learning pathways and items for it itself. But this is a really good one, for you to communicate to users if they want to get deeper into that type of technology. Now, for those of you that are in charge of the actual deployment of Microsoft Teams, there's a lot of different elements and features that are available on the Microsoft website itself. Some of it is change management focused of it. Some of it is, some of the ability for adoption services. You of course have the certifications that come with the tests that are out there. In terms of that, I think the number is MS700 for that specific Teams administrator certification. And then of course there's developer portions of it. The one that I like the best, though, is this specific tool here from a 365 adoption. This is through EDX for it. It's been around for 2 or 3 years. But with that being said, you can either enroll and pay for a certification, or you can enroll and essentially audit the specific area. And so with that being said, there's a lot of good concepts and contents there for you to keep track of. But it goes through the Microsoft concepts in terms of what you should look at from an adoption piece of it. And so over here on the right-hand side, I'll go ahead and circle it. These are some of the steps to think about in terms of assembling your team. Who's going to be on the main stakeholders? Now, a lot of you might already have Microsoft Teams deployed and enabled, and you're struggling, right? You see users using it for one use case, right? They're using it for chat, or they're using it for meetings, but they're not using it for the teamwork. Or maybe you had this growth and explosiveness in Teams, but now you're seeing nobody using it or complaining about the amount of notifications. Reviewing where you're at in the process is not a bad thing, right? Stepping back and saying, all right, we've had this tool or technology in place now for 3 or 4 years. How can we use it more effectively, or how can we use it more efficiently across our organization? Just because it's not brand new doesn't mean there's not new features, doesn't mean it's not a chance to step back and review and see, all right, where are we at today and how can we use it more efficiently with it for it. All right, let's get into some of the nuts and bolts here. There's 3 phases of adoption. The first phase that's out there is the starting phase that's there. And so when you think about that starting phase itself, there's a few items here to talk through. The first one is we need a plan and get started, right? We need to have some sort of plan in place, whether it's a project plan, whether it's just an initial statement on why we're here. We also need to deploy and create a project team. And depending upon the size of your organization, the project team might be a dozen people. It might be you and a colleague. It could also just be you. But with that being said, the reason why it's important to have more than just you there is because you may think or see something that's there, but the rest of the organization sees it differently. And let me do a timeout here and explain what I mean by that. One of the components that I was struggling with at the beginning of the pandemic and the beginning of kind of the use and growth of Microsoft Teams a little over a year ago was users saying, talking about scheduling meetings. And I was like, well, it's easy to schedule meetings. You just go into calendar in your Teams, click new meeting, schedule it, you're good to go. Users were saying to me, well, that's not how I'm used to doing it, right? So then we'd have to introduce the Outlook add-on there. Some users would use the calendar with inside of Teams to schedule it. Then you have that one user that uses the calendar with inside of Teams, but then tags the channel. And your mind is like, come on, can you just do it the same way for everybody? And so that's where it's important for you to come up with what is the best case scenario and what is the best process. And if you think of any technology from Microsoft, there's 4, 5, 6 different ways to do something. And so this is the same component here itself. Having a robust and unique project team will ensure that you're covering all your bases. Teams and channels and first teams and organizational readiness, I'm going to group those all together a little bit here. But creating your teams and channels and your first teams. Now, again, if you're already into this journey, you can review what's already been out there and created, right? You can see the teams and the usage and those types of items. If you're not in that journey yet, if you've turned off the teamwork side of it, understanding who can create your teams, understanding and developing, maybe you make everyone that's going to be an owner of a team go through a training session. Maybe it's a 30 or 45-minute training session on here's why it's important that you're a team owner. Don't forget about the whole concept of training. Don't forget about the concept of enabling your users. Maybe it's as easy as a process as let's restrict or use that request to Teams app that Microsoft has available. Maybe you're building your own process through Flow or Automate that will help with it. And then understanding who your first teams are. Who's going to be your first guinea pig? What department or what area is going to be your first area that's there? And then understanding from an organizational side of it itself is, who in the organization, how ready are we as an organization to move down that path? Phase 2 is my favorite phase, and a lot of you are probably in this area right now. And you might have just been in this area because that's how you've done it, and that's just where you're at, right? The experiment phase. When you think about the experiment phase, that's the idea of how are we going to use it? And a lot of organizations that deployed teams quickly last year are still in this phase. They turned it on. They told users, here you go, use it. But what are they missing? They're not gathering any feedback. They just have it on for the users. And they say, go ahead, use it. They're not documenting or defining usage scenarios. If you just have teams on and you don't have use cases and how the tool is going to work in the organization, you're missing it here. You need to come back and review this. The quick start and the onboarding support and some of the training that's out there, of course, those are all important items, and Microsoft has templates and documents and examples and web pages and content all available for you. But take a step back and say, if I don't know how Microsoft Teams is supposed to be used in my organization, what do I need to answer? What do I need to look at? Think about any tool or technology you use, and there's a business purpose for it, right? If you're going to go out and buy a new tool like Smartsheets or Rike or another project management tool, you probably have to come up with some sort of use case on how you're going to use it and why it's important and what other technology can't fit the build anymore. I'll tell a little story from an RSM perspective. So RSM, about 5-6 years ago, rolled out Cisco Jabber for an instant messaging tool prior to Teams being available, okay? Now Teams is available a couple years ago, and one of the biggest components that we had to work on internally as an organization was how is it different than the other instant messaging tool that's out there, and how do we define some of those usage scenarios? And so it took some time and effort to do that, but also having a pilot program, gathering that feedback, and then essentially supporting our users along the way. Now, the last phase that's there, and some of you may be here as well, is the scaling side of it. Now you're growing the implementation and growing the specific items that are out there. And so that's the idea here of scaling. And so measuring that success, collecting that feedback, and you heard that during the opening session today about, gathering feedback, whether it's personal or organizational. Reviewing some of the stakeholder engagement, reviewing the business engagement. Just like what Microsoft does. If you hadn't heard, Microsoft just announced this week that they have 145 million daily users of Teams. That's huge, right? That's the engagement that's out there. Now you could unpack that and try to say, all right, how many, what does a daily user of Teams actually mean? But we're all here. We're all using Teams. So I think that's an important piece to think about. And one of the things that I don't know if this is true, I saw it on Twitter, so you take it with a grain of salt. I don't know the total population of the world. But somebody posted online that 145 million is roughly 2% of the world's population. So maybe somebody wants to fact check that here. But anyways, with that, that's insane, right? That's crazy to think about. Feedback and reporting, constantly collecting that feedback. What's working well, what's not working well. Maybe you made that decision to turn off guest access at the beginning or external access to be able to communicate with someone outside of the organization. And people are upset or angry that they can't communicate with a consultant or with another firm or organization that they work with. That they have to resort back to email, and it's just not efficient. Awareness and training campaigns. If you're not doing that element here, you're missing the boat. Teams is changing constantly. There's new icons that come out. There's new features that come out. The new meeting experience, the together mode. All those items here, breakout rooms. I mean, we could start naming off all these new features that did not exist 3-4 months ago. And now they exist, right? Custom status messages, resetting it, customizing your out of office directly from Teams. So from that side of it, you're constantly should be, whether it's quarterly, monthly might be a little bit too much, but whether it's quarterly or otherwise, constantly telling people what's new and what's working for it. Self-service health reviews, I think that's an important piece just to take a step back. Maybe it's not your role in your organization. Maybe it's your IT administrator side of it, but certainly scheduling those, seeing the usage, what users are using, what users are not using, reviewing, some of the usage reports that are out there. And we'll dive a little bit into that here. All right, let's get into a few different demos here, and then we'll jump back to the deck in a little bit here. We're going to take a look at two different Teams templates that Microsoft has available. One is called Adopt 365, and the other is the deployment of Teams. We're also going to take a look at some of the apps that are available and the ability to include the training component. Also take a look at the forms. So let me go ahead and open up a environment here. All right. I'll zoom in on this here so that way for those of you that may be on a smaller screen or smaller monitor, you have the ability to see it a little bit easier. The first thing I want to make a quick mention to, with that is I'm using the browser experience of it. Of course, it just helps with the usage and the sharing of my screen and my content here. The first team that's available, if you're not aware, Microsoft Teams has templates available itself. You can create your own templates if you're someone that creates those, but you can also use a template that Microsoft creates. And I can jump in and show you where those are at here. There's ones for managing a project, there's managing events, help desk, employees, global crisis, responses, bank related or financial services quality. The one that, I think is important here is this Adopt 365. Now, you may say, well, what in the world am I getting here? Well, the key thing is you're getting a simple structure, right? You're getting an announcements area. You're getting a champion's corner or a specific, channel that's available just for champions. If you obviously you'd have to create it as a private channel. Also the ability for forums in the calendar. You're getting 2 apps. The channel calendar, if you haven't seen that here, we'll take a look at that. And then the ever not so popular wiki app also is available for you. With that being said, though, that's just one of the templates that's here. Now, there's another template for the deployment of teams, which is a much more robust in terms of what it includes. But again, that's maybe a little bit more IT focused here. In this case here, I think this is any technology. It does not have to just be 365. Maybe you have a new ERP system or a new system whatsoever. You can utilize a team. I'm already have one created here for us, so we don't need to create a new one here. So when we're taking a look at it, of course, you can see on the left-hand side, I have the general channel, I have the announcements, I have a calendar area, I have a champions corner, and this is what it comes with. It's pretty simple or out of the box, right? Nothing too crazy from it. Using your announcements area, I think is key. Possibly getting that email address, so that way when you subscribe to those feeds, you subscribe to alerts on what's coming soon or what's upcoming, feel free to utilize that email address as an example to make that happen. One of the key elements here, you have the calendar portion of it, and that's the channel calendar. If you haven't experienced the channel calendar side of it, it's really just in a calendar that's related for that specific channel for that, but the ability to display that here as well if you're interested. That again is a pretty lightweight template for it. It's really just your channels. There's not a whole lot of content that comes with it. The one that I like a little bit better, and this gets deployed from the admin side of the world, is the deployment team itself. And so when you're taking a look at the deployment team, this has been created here for a little over a year, but it has not changed for it. But if we jump in and let's say you're rolling out chat teams, meetings, or chat teams, channels, and apps, there's a few items here to take a look at. The first thing to think about is there's some forms that are out there. There's also a Microsoft plan that automatically gets created for you. And when you're taking a look at this Microsoft plan that gets created for you already, you see some of the main items here, right? There's your kind of first phase of getting ready, right? Defining some of the usage. Then you have your next thing of that experimental. Then you have the scale, right? So it does match up to those 3 phases that we already talked about. But if we just unpack and expand some of that usage side of it here, there's specific checklists and examples that are here. There's links that Microsoft has included in on this as well for that. That is just a sample team that gets deployed from a deployment side of it to be able to help with the adoption and the deployment of the technology. Now, that may not be quite adoption specific, but again, with that being said, use the tools that are out there to help you itself. Take this planner and customize it and delete the tasks that you don't need or that you've already done, or modify those out there for it. If we take a look at the meeting and conferencing side of it, of course, that is generally separated for a lot of organizations just because, they may have GoToMeeting or Zoom or, Ring Central meetings or whatever the case may be. But with that being said, of course, you have your getting ready, configuring the meeting policies, archiving, recording devices if you need, kind of that interoperability, audio conferencing and live events, and who has the ability to do those and set up policies that way. So these are a lot of the elements that most people forget about and that they just need to go back in and review. If you didn't have a thoughtful Teams deployment, I would encourage you here to take a look at and actually see that. Thanks, Michelle. I just happened to peek over and see the wiki side of the world. One of these days, you guys need to make a way to have it eliminated. But anyways.
Or make it a SharePoint page, right?
Or a one, yeah, there's a handful of other things that you could do, or the OneNote or something of that nature. Yeah, I got asked the other day, unrelated or little related, I got asked the other day if you could remove posts off of a team because all they wanted was files, and I did the face palm on that one for it. So with that being said, though, when you think about the idea of it, there's a lot of different elements here to go through. Now, one of the pieces that I always struggle with is collecting feedback, right? I think what I do is amazing, right? Most of you probably are the same way. However, taking the step back and saying, from a feedback perspective, what are we missing? What can we do better at? What feature don't we have available, right? Asking those questions that are there. And so some of that is self-reflection, right? Some of that is the ability for you to understand and not to be scared of what users are going to say or what users are going to have the feedback. With that being said here, this form, you don't have to, use this or steal this here specifically. And actually, let me go ahead. Let me open it up in the browser here, and I'll share it out for each of you. If you want to take it, feel free to fill it out here itself. So we'll just use this user satisfaction one here. I'll go ahead and share, and we'll say anyone can respond. Sure, we'll shorten the URL. All right, I'll put this in the chat window here. All right, so if you're interested in taking it, feel free to take it itself. But, looking at this, these are really some pretty good questions, and it's not long, right? It's not long, but if you're someone that has not taken a step back and said, and I'm making an assumption here that most of you have Microsoft Teams deployed or that you're using it either in a pocket or across the entire organization. So if you're not there yet, of course, this is where you'll hopefully get. But that user satisfaction, what is working well and what is not working well? If you don't ask your users, you may have no idea, right? In some of it, you're handcuffed, right? The wiki concept, you're handcuffed. I got asked the question the other day of, how do I set my working hours on Teams so I don't get pinged at 9 p.m. at night when my phone says I'm available? Well, the answer is log out, right? So some of it you're handcuffed, that there's no option for you to come up with a solution. You're just limited or stuck there. With this being said here, though, this is a really good way to start. Understanding that I need to collect feedback, and maybe you're an organization that uses Survey 123 or Survey Monkey, and this is a good way to move to forms. Treating it as anonymous, I think, is important for this type of feedback. Collecting names, I think, is an optional component here, but of course, it's up to you. Some organizations treat that differently. We got a few of you that, if you haven't seen the form side of it, we got a few of you here to take a look at itself. All right, 4.33, that's okay. Of course, using Teams for calling, is the very end side of it. And I think that we would all probably agree that the phone system capability of it is probably the unknown for a lot of you, but using it on our mobile device, collaboration, Teams, chatting, apps, right? So, this is a pretty good. Thank you for those of you that have taken it. All right. But, with that being said, I think it's important for you to really understand where your users are at in collecting that feedback. And for some of you, it may be as simple as you just sending that survey out or sending that form out. Maybe some of you, it's embedding it onto a SharePoint page, or like what this is it's built in for you. So what I wanted to take a moment here to talk about is, the templates that are available that can help you with the adoption and the understanding, of the technology itself. So thank you for those of you that took it. A real life example there. All right. With that being said, let's jump a little bit here into some of the use cases that are out there. And so when we start to define some of those use cases, I think it's really important to think about, how are we doing it, right? Are we using it from a project focused area? Are we using it for processing, whether we're using the new approvals app that's built in, or are we going to help from a people perspective? Are we going to use it to keep our people connected into a team or group environment? And the use case that I'll share around the people side of it is an organization that I'm working with that's global. And they have a need for a one-way communication for each of their 15 different plants or production facilities, where somebody in HR or somebody in operations can post if there's an urgent message, can post announcements, allow commenting and allow feedback, but really moderate that channel, right? And so that's one use case here from a Teams perspective is having it location specific for it and having that single repository for users, that may not use email or keep up to date on email. So let's unpack the project side of the world. So if we unpack the project side of the world here, different items, right? We can use it for scheduling of check-in meetings, whether they're channel or otherwise. We can collaborate on documents. We can access and assign tasks and deadlines from a Microsoft Planner side of the world or To-Do as well. We can share information. We can collect approval processes that's there. So that's one example. Next example here is, maybe diving deeper into it is from like a launch event side of the world. Actually looking at keeping track of what's available and pulling my team together, sharing the information, having all that ability, external access. Those are all items that are important and to be able to communicate and to effectively go through. Sharing of information, assigning tasks and deadlines here. So jumping over to a plan as an example for us. Scheduling the check-in meetings. Now, with that being said, some of these are pretty self-explanatory, but I think it's important for you to, really take a second here to think about what's the important items and elements that are there. And the reason why that's important is you can, of course, granular control a lot of these different items and elements that are there. And so the more efficient you can be, the more controlling you can be, the more documentation you can be, the better off you're going to be from an organizational kind of deployment side of it. Continuing on here for ourselves, as we're taking a look, maybe it's the sales cycle side of the world. So how are we using it from a sales perspective itself? I have a client of mine that's a construction client, and they use a team to really help build from the proposal, from the bidding to the actual implementation side of the world. And so understanding where that process comes through itself, and we'll skip over some of the examples here for it, but of course there's videos that can help you with that. If you go and download the deck, you'll see that. Cultural transformation, actually using it for conversations or town halls. One of the unique use cases here from a town hall perspective that I want to just take a second and share about is I have a client that's based in California, but has offices from Washington, D.C. all the way to Hawaii. Roughly 600 employees spread, obviously across all time zones of the United States. But we recently used Microsoft Live Events to help with the town hall experience. And we flip-flop between whether do we use a meeting or do we use a live event to help out with that type of information. And I won't get into the details here specifically. We chose a live event for a variety of purposes itself. One was just the presentation and the quality of what the user sees, and the less of the muting and turn off your video, and we're getting background feedback and those types of items here. But that was a really good definition use case. They were prepared to go out and buy a tool or pay for a subscription for it, but we were able to utilize Teams to make that happen. Conversations, of course, that's pretty self-explanatory or no-brainer item that's there. All right, let's move into the training side of it itself. There's a few different items here from a training component, and we'll jump back into the demo here in just a second. And like I said at the beginning of the session, from a training perspective, one of the components that I'm a huge fan of is learning pathways. And there's a session, I believe there's a session devoted to learning pathways. If not, you can certainly dive deeper into it. But it is a SharePoint site template that is 100% available to you, that allows you to build, configure, add, remove content or training content that's there. It is up to date. It does require an update process if it does get out of date for it. But what it really allows you to do is, instead of directing users to the Microsoft support documentation, you're directing them to somewhere on your site for it. Let's take a peek at it here. And there's a few slides, if I dive deeper into that we can expand that and take a look at. But let's jump out here into Teams for us. With that being said, I have it deployed as an app. There's directions online on how to do that or process and bring that in as a site. Of course, if you're someone that's experimented or played with Viva Connections, process is very similar to that. In this case, here's my learning pathways itself. And so learning pathways is a site. It's a communication site that can get deployed, that has all the different components. This has not been customized. This is purely, what you see is what's out there for you. So there's different items here, whether or not I want to go ahead and become a champion, or maybe I have specific events that I want the queue and go through for us. I'm just going to jump into the Microsoft 365 training. In this case, it opened up in the browser experience. You have the ability to see what it looks like. So here I have the ability to see, different playlists that are out there, or scenarios that are there, products that are there. Maybe you want to make lists available for users, but you don't necessarily need to talk a lot about them. Or, gosh, access we want to turn off. You can turn that off and make modifications to it. Let me go ahead and jump into Teams. You should recognize these little icons if you've ever been out to the Microsoft support pages. Those elements that are all there. Oops, let me get back there real quick. Somehow I lost it. There we go. Those elements that are all there, of course, allow you to easily come through and navigate to that area. And yes, you can add in your own content that's there if you choose. But with that being said, I can jump into the different areas. I can turn each of these elements off. Now, with that being said, that's the learning pathways side of the world. That's a SharePoint site that gets basically created by going to the SharePoint lookbook site, deploying it as a solution, and then you can package it up as an app and deploy it inside of your environment. The other training piece that I think a lot of us forget about, to be honest with you, and let me just jump into the Teams client on my computer here real quick. For us, this is one that I think a lot of you, may forget or miss here for it. Is down below in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a help section. And a lot of us don't ask for help, right? We're afraid to ask for help, or we just don't, necessarily ask for help on the process itself. Here, when we're taking a look, I keep minimizing things here. Apologize for that. There we go. If I click on help here, you'll notice that there's different topics that are there. There's the ability for me to see what's new. If you're in the middle of a deployment of Microsoft Teams, or maybe you've deployed Microsoft Teams a year ago, 2 years ago, and you're like, gosh, I can't keep track of what's new. In this case, they augment and bring it all together for you, right? So telling users that's out there in terms of what's new and what features are out there for it, the desktop and the web. Gosh, if you're someone, I use this all the time now. This feature that's out there is the sharing an email from Teams, or to Teams rather, from Outlook. It's a click of a button. If you don't use it, it's a game changer. And honestly, others on my team, others that may not be focusing on Microsoft Teams on 100% time, wonder how I get the emails into Teams. And it's a click of a button, right? They just weren't aware that it was out there. So in this case of it, those are all items here to think about and to refer to itself. But let's jump into the training side of it across the top. If you're someone that has a new user or has a employee that's struggling with how to use Teams, in addition to you defining and creating your own use cases yourself to help with that adoption, other items that are out there, of course, is the ability here, to take a look at and have short videos that are there. Prior to joining RSM 5.5 years ago, I was a Microsoft certified trainer, still am, but I was with a learning partner, and we did a lot of week-long training courses. And looking at some of your names, I recognize some of you from those trainings. However, with that, now one of the components that a lot of people want is those quick, ad hoc, little training segments, whether it's a video or text-based itself. And so in this case of it, you have all these available for it. It's all there for you. You know, one of the components that came out from that survey that I shared was obviously making calls was a component, you know, that users struggle with or may not be aware of itself. Your directions are all there, right? So don't be afraid to reuse what's there to help with user adoption in user use cases along the way. Now let's take a step here, and I'm going to just talk about one of my favorite apps that I think goes unnoticed. I have two of them here that I'm going to touch on that can help out with user adoption. They're not training focused, right? They're not learning pathways. They're not the training element that's here for you. They're really designed or mentioned for you to help with users see that Microsoft Teams does more than just one thing. So if you're starting to see that users are only using Microsoft Teams for chat, or they're only using Microsoft Teams for the teamwork area and they're resorting back to email, this is where you can help with that by introducing other applications or other tools that are out there. So in this case, the one that I really like, and this is a demo environment for me, so it's not as robust as if I looked at my work environment here, is the idea of insights. And depending upon your licensing, you know, this may or may not be available. For most of you, it will be available from a licensing perspective. It's called Insights. You may have recognized it from Outlook. Maybe it's the My Analytics component that you're keeping track of or used in the past. In this case, it brings it directly into Teams. Of course, this is a demo environment. I haven't made any changes to this. I don't have a lot of content or follow through or follow-up items here to think about itself. But, you know, with that, I have focus time scheduled till 12 p.m. I have the ability to do my check-in in terms of how I'm feeling over time. And I can see my reflection history over time. Maybe I see myself, you know, ebb and flow and increase or decrease. And I can say, hey, looking back 2 weeks ago, I know why I wasn't, you know, as good. I was going through this in my personal life. You're the only one that sees it, right? So some people may like this. This is like a little journal almost when it comes to it. There's a breaking side of it to do a breathing exercise if I want to. I won't actually play it, but it's you know, a way for you to go through and reduce some of your stress. Feedback, you know, this is one that helps with the adoption. I see this help out a ton. The more content you can post and the more interactive you are from a Teams perspective, the better and the more widely the adoption would be used, which sending praise can help with that. Staying connected, this is one that's not populated. If I jumped into my RSM account, you'd actually see a lot of information there. But whether you have collaborators you work on or emails that you've promised you're going to follow up on, this is one that I look at least on a weekly basis. If there's a message that I sent out that said, hey, I'll get to this by the end of the week or by the end of the day, it's going to show up there as being, have you done this yet? And so that's an important element that's out there. Protecting time, you know, the ability to protect focus time. Focus time is one of those items that I find value in, because if I don't protect my time, I'm almost stuck in meetings all the time. With that also being said, it's just a protection of time, and you can control, you know, how much time you're available. And then the other piece that I think is really fun is the virtual commute. This is a newer element or a newer addition here in the last few weeks to help out with those of you that are working from home, is that, you know, that virtual kind of commute. What tasks did I need to get done, or do I want to set a reminder up tomorrow? You know, maybe tomorrow I want to remember to eat. And so it can schedule a task here specifically for me to make that happen. And so I think that that's an important element. You know, if you have this available and you know users are not using it, take a second, step back, and communicate that out to users, right? The more that they're in Teams, even if they're not picking it up from a chat perspective, if they're using it for insights, they're going to natively start to use it for all the different tools that Teams has to offer. And of course, from an administrator side of it, you can pin this in place or have it available for users as well. The next one here that I'm going to take a look at here is one called Tasks by Planner and To Do. And again, with it being a demo environment, let me actually switch to my other environment that I'm logged in here real quick so you can see it. Maybe I don't have it. There it is. I don't know when they're renaming this. I think that's being renamed at some point itself. But in this case here, you obviously have the ability to see some of your tasks that are out there itself. So these are tasks, that are there. If you're interested, my task that I just created that said remind me tomorrow is actually on my tasks for tomorrow with the due date of tomorrow. So it automatically did that for me, which is neat. But again, what I really like about this here is it doesn't only bring my tasks in that I may assign myself an Outlook or somebody assigns to me otherwise. It can also bring in my planner tasks as well if I choose along the way. And then the other items that it can do, as well, and we're not seeing that here specifically, is the ability to actually see emails that have been flagged. So if you're someone that flags or follows up on emails, a lot of good items can come, from that. And again, I think mentioning to users on how that integration works and that they can use Teams for more than just those 4 workloads really can help with the adoption, especially for some of you that are already out there and already using, the tools themselves itself. The last piece that I'll touch on here, and then we'll wrap up for our session this morning, is the idea of keyboard shortcuts. And so, a lot of people that I know, a lot of people that I work with really love the idea of keyboard shortcuts. And they say, I guess I can't get the Zoom to come in. Sorry about that. They really say the idea of like, I see myself being more efficient if I use keyboard shortcuts. Do you have a list of keyboard shortcuts? This is one of the items here I think that goes unnoticed is the communication of you can use keyboard shortcuts within inside of Teams, just like you can in Outlook or just like you can in Word and Excel and PowerPoint or other tools that users use on a regular basis. So from that side of it, there is obviously pages of content that are out there in terms of shortcuts and communication, that you can use or communicate those information out itself. So I think it's important item here to step back and say, gather that feedback, whether you're in the beginning of your adoption process or in the middle or at the end. You'll never be at the end. You'll always be in the middle. But what are users struggling with, right? So gathering that feedback, collecting that information, and then being targeted about what type of communication are we rolling out? Is it a full-blown training where I'm presenting to different people? Am I recording? Am I writing up? Relate back to that opening, to the session before where they walk through each of those elements. Do what you're comfortable with. I'm comfortable jumping on a camera and doing a meeting, right? That's just what I'm comfortable with. I have colleagues of mine that would rather take time and record everything and have users watch the video itself. I have colleagues of mine that are really good at technical documentation and writing things up. So do what you're comfortable with, gather that feedback, and continue to do, continue to evolve, continue to explore. In closing here, as you're taking a look at it, if you're just using Microsoft Teams for chat, for collaboration or sharing of files and meetings, you're really missing the boat. Microsoft Teams is that platform that you can add other tools in, whether it's a third-party app like Smartsheets, Trello, Wrike, whatever the case may be, or whether it's just integrating some of those SharePoint components in at the same time. For instance, that approval component that's here. this is one that I think is really important, that if you have a user, if you have a Flow or Power Automate that has an approval process, guess what? They'll show up here. So from a user perspective, you have the ability to keep track of it, and to look through it, and to have these apps available for users itself. But also at the same time, understanding that giving users all of them at once is probably not the most efficient way, right? Think about when you learned to drive. You didn't just say, I'm going to jump on the highway and drive at 80, at 70 miles an hour right away. You took your time. You learned different items. Users need the same thing. They need to be able to identify, why should they use this? How do they use it? How is it being used in the organization? What's the best practice from that side of it? Once you have those defined, then of course the communication itself, but always being available to go back and review what's previously out there. In closing here, let's take a look at that form here real quick. We got 6 responses for most of you here. We got a 4.4 rating on Teams from an experience side of it itself. Channel conversations, I'm assuming you took these seriously. If not, that's okay. But again, looking at that, we probably don't need to, if I was reviewing this, what don't I need to spend time on? Teams, channels, and chatting, right? Mobile experience. Okay, well, we're 50-50 in terms of comfort level. Using specific Teams apps. Some of you are, we're comfortable, but not quite. Using Teams for calling. What is that use case? I think about that use case as being kind of the drive-by. And what I refer by to the drive-by is when in the past, when I used to just get up out of my desk, walk over to somebody's cube or office, knock on the door, and have a conversation with them. That's impossible to do if you're not in the same physical space anymore. But maybe there's just some, targeted effort here from a calling perspective, so users know how that process can work, and how that process can be, more or less communicated. So with that here, we've been going for about 75 minutes. I want to make sure everyone has a little bit of a break as we're transitioning to other sessions here this morning. With that, thank you for your time here this morning. The next one in here is the Learning Pathways session. So I didn't take away all of Sherry's content here with the Learning Pathways, but just hopefully enough as a teaser to keep you around, right, Ted?
Yes, thank you, Pat. This was great.